My name is Adaeze. I am 28 years old. I work as an estate paralegal, and I found out my sister had told 40 relatives I stole $31,000 from our mother in her final weeks on the same day our mother's lawyer called to say the recording was ready. Let me explain what recording, because it's the whole story. My sister Adaeze is 5 years older than me, and she stood up at our mother's repast, not the funeral, the repast, while people still had plates of food in their hands, and she told the room that she had gone through Mama's accounts and found $31,000 missing, and that she knew who had taken it, and that she was sorry to have to say this today of all days, but the family deserved to know the truth. She was so sorry. She was so devastated. She looked like a woman carrying a burden too heavy for her heart. And she looked at me. Every person in that room turned and looked at me. Aunties who had held me as a baby. Cousins I'd grown up with. My mother's oldest friends, women who'd known our family for 30 years. They all turned and looked at me, Zara, the younger one, the quiet one who'd moved back home to care for Mama in her final months, who'd sat with her through the nights when the pain was bad and held her hand when the morphine made her confused and handled every piece of her financial and legal affairs for the last year of her life. I did not stand up. I did not defend myself. I have spent my entire career watching families destroy each other in and around estates, and I have learned the most important lesson that work teaches: the person who makes a scene at a repast becomes the story, and the story buries the truth. I sat very still, and I looked at my sister, and I said nothing, and I let her believe that my silence was guilt. Because my sister had made one enormous mistake, and she made it because she had spent Mama's illness on the other side of the country, flying in for long weekends and leaving again, and she had used that distance to build a story about what I'd been doing while she was gone, and she'd built it so completely in her own mind that she genuinely believed it. She believed I had stolen. She believed the quiet sister who'd moved home to be useful had used that usefulness to help herself. And I think that matters, in a way that changes how angry I can be with her. Adaeze did not stand up at that repast as a performance. She stood up because she had done the math in her head, the accounts, the transfers, the access I'd had, the distance she'd been at, and the math had told her a story that felt true. The problem with the story was that she'd done it without a single piece of the actual documentation, without calling me, without calling Mr. Asante, without doing anything that might have complicated the version that was forming in her head. She'd assembled a case from her imagination and brought it to a room full of grieving people as though it were fact. And she'd done it because the other explanation, that her little sister had been here, doing the work, trusted by Mama in the fullest and most formal sense, was an explanation that would have required her to reckon with 4 years of absence. It was easier to make me the villain than to sit with what her distance had cost. I understood that. It didn't make it forgivable. But understanding it meant I could be angry without being hollowed out by it. She didn't know that our mother's lawyer had a recording. She didn't know that 3 months before Mama died, on a Tuesday afternoon in a law office, our mother had sat across from that lawyer, clear-eyed, competent, freshly off the medication that sometimes clouded her, and had given a recorded statement about every transaction I had ever made on her behalf, explaining each one in her own words, in her own voice, naming me as her trustee, and stating, on the record, exactly what she had asked me to do with her money and why. She didn't know our mother had seen this coming. Mama saw everything coming, in the end. She just chose to see it quietly, and to give the truth somewhere safe to live. Before I tell you what was on that recording, and what happened when the lawyer played it for the family, tell me what time it is where you are right now, and whether you've ever been accused of the exact thing you sacrificed yourself to do right. I want to see how far this story travels. I have to explain what I do, because it's the whole spine of this story, and it's the exact thing my family treated as a footnote to my sister's more glamorous life. I'm an estate paralegal. I work at a firm that handles the legal machinery of death, wills, trusts, powers of attorney, probate, the endless unglamorous paperwork that stands between a family and chaos when someone they love dies. It is not a career anyone brings up at parties unless they want to clear the room. But it taught me 2 things that turned out to save my life. The first, documentation is protection. In the world of estates, what's written, recorded, and witnessed is the truth. What someone claims after the fact, no matter how emotional, no matter how sincerely believed, is an opinion until it meets the record. I learned to document everything, habitually, compulsively, the way my profession demands, because the record is the only thing that holds in a family fight. I want to be concrete about what that means, because my family treated it as an abstraction. In my office we see it every week. A parent dies, the children gather, and the stories begin. Not lying, exactly, each person genuinely believes their version. The one who was there remembers the conversations. The one who wasn't remembers the stories they told themselves to explain their distance. And when those versions collide over a bank account or a piece of property, the only thing that can separate them is paper. A signed document. A dated receipt. A record that existed before the grief did, before the accusation, before anyone needed to be right. I went into this work because I find it meaningful. I stayed in it because it teaches you, at 28, a thing most people only learn when it's too late: love is not enough to protect the truth. Only the record is enough. And the people who leave good records are the people who understood, quietly, that love is the reason you make them. The second, the person who controls the paperwork, controls the narrative. Not through deception, through preparation. The families who survive loss intact are the ones who did the hard, uncomfortable work of getting everything written down while they still could. The families who fall apart are the ones who assumed their love for each other would be enough to sort it out later. Love is never enough. The document is what holds. My family found my job morbid in the affectionate way they found most things about me morbid. Adaeze had the interesting career. She worked in international development, flew to conferences, had a title that sounded important, lived in a city where people were impressed by titles. I drove 40 minutes to a law office and helped old people sort out what happened to their houses. My mother called it important. Adaeze called it Zara's death paperwork. And at family gatherings, whenever the subject came up, I would explain it, and Adaeze would change the subject, because the successful sister was not going to be upstaged at dinner by the vocabulary of probate. I want to be fair, because fairness is the whole point of this story. Adaeze was not born cruel. She was the eldest, the overachiever, the daughter who'd left home at 18 and built a life our mother bragged about, and she'd done it partly by making herself indispensable at a distance, the phone calls, the money sent home, the glamorous visits, while I did the unglamorous things up close. And I think somewhere in the last year of Mama's life, as I became more and more the one who was there, Adaeze felt herself losing something she didn't even know she needed. She was losing the role of the good daughter. And a person who loses the role of the good daughter, in a family where that role was everything, does not go looking for a new self-understanding. They look for a reason the other daughter is the bad one instead. There were 3 moments I never let myself feel until that repast made me feel all of them at once. When I was 24 and moved back home to help Mama after her first diagnosis, Adaeze called me the same week and said, warmly, that it was so good that I could be there, that she wished she could do more, that she was sending money. She sent the money for 3 months. I stayed for 4 years. At every family gathering in those years, Adaeze was celebrated for being the one who'd made it, and I was thanked for being the one who showed up, and the thanks always had a note in it: thank you for doing what the rest of us couldn't. That made my sacrifice sound like a limitation rather than a choice. When I was 26 and Mama gave me formal power of attorney, I told Adaeze, and she said, that makes sense, since you're there, and never asked a single question about what it meant or what it would require of me. And in Mama's final months, when I was managing her care, her finances, her medications, her appointments, her moments of confusion and her moments of grace, Adaeze called twice a week and got the highlight reel, and she took those calls and assembled from them a picture of what I was doing that was vivid and confident and entirely wrong. She thought she understood what was happening in that house. She was hearing a summary while I was living the footnotes. Each of those moments was warm on the surface. That was the trap. Each one let Adaeze maintain the story that she was the daughter who had succeeded, and I was the daughter who had stayed, and staying was a kind of failure dressed up as devotion. She needed that story. And so when Mama died and the accounts showed $31,000 moved in the final year, Adaeze assembled the version that preserved her story. I had taken advantage. The quiet daughter had used her access to help herself. The one who'd been there had been there for the wrong reasons. She was wrong in every particular. And our mother had made sure there would be a record to prove it. Let me tell you what the $31,000 actually was, because that number is the whole thing. In the last year of her life, as Mama's illness progressed and it became clear she would not recover, she and I had a series of conversations that I believe were the most important of her life. She was clear-eyed in those conversations, precise, the way she'd always been precise. Mama was an accountant for 30 years. She did not lose track of numbers even when the illness took other things. She knew exactly what she had, what she wanted to do with it, and why. She wanted to do 3 things. First, she wanted to pay for her own care as long as possible, out of her own accounts, so that the money she'd saved for her daughters wouldn't be consumed by the last years of her life any more than necessary. Second, she wanted to make a series of gifts to people and causes that had mattered to her, her church, a cousin who was struggling, a scholarship fund she'd supported for years, before she died, because she wanted to give the gifts herself, while she was alive to see them received, rather than have them distributed coldly by a lawyer after the fact. And third, she wanted to make sure Adaeze received her full share of the estate cleanly, without complication, because she knew, though she never said it in those words, that Adaeze would look at the accounts after she was gone and make exactly the assumptions that Adaeze made. She told me all of this, and I helped her do all of it, over the course of 11 months, the way I help any client, with documentation, with proper authority, with every transaction recorded and explained and filed. Every single dollar of those $31,000 had a paper trail. Every gift had a record. Every care payment had a receipt. Every transfer I made under the power of attorney Mama had given me, with her knowledge, at her instruction, documented in the files of her lawyer's office. And 3 months before she died, Mama asked her lawyer to make a recorded statement. She'd thought about it, she said, and she wanted there to be something that couldn't be misread. Not a document. Documents can be disputed, can be claimed to have been signed under duress, can be questioned. A recording. Her voice, her words, her accounting of what she'd chosen to do with her own money and why, and who had helped her do it. She sat in that office on a Tuesday afternoon and she talked for 45 minutes, and she named every transaction, and she named me, and she said the thing that I could never have said for myself, that I had given up 4 years of my life to care for her without complaint, and that she had trusted me completely, and that every cent had gone exactly where she'd chosen to put it, and that if anyone, she said if anyone, suggested otherwise, they should call the lawyer and ask for the recording. She made that recording, and she went home, and she lived 3 more months, and she never told Adaeze it existed. I want to tell you about the night before the repast, because it is the part of this story I think about most. I was alone in Mama's house, the night before, cleaning up the way you clean up after someone is gone, not cleaning, really, just moving through the rooms that smell like her, touching the things she touched, keeping the grief in motion so it doesn't settle into something too heavy to lift. And I found, in the drawer of her bedside table, a note she'd written to me. Not a legal document, not an instruction, a note, in her handwriting, 3 lines. It said, Zara. You did everything right. I made sure they'll know. Love, Mama. She knew. She knew Adaeze would look at the accounts and make the accusation. She knew because she knew her daughters, completely, in the way mothers do, and she had loved them both with open eyes, and she had made the recording because she was not willing to let the one who had given everything be accused of taking it. She left me that note so I would know, in the worst moment, that she had seen me. That she had prepared the truth. That I would not have to stand alone in a room full of relatives and defend myself with only my word. I folded that note and I put it in my pocket, and I went to the repast the next day, and when my sister made her announcement and 40 heads turned toward me, I said nothing, and I held the note in my pocket, and I waited. The lawyer called me 2 hours after the repast. His name was Mr. Asante, and he had handled our mother's estate for 6 years, and he was the calmest man I have ever dealt with in a profession full of calm men, and he said, "I understand there was an incident today. Your mother told me this might happen. She asked me to hold the recording until after the burial. I think it's time for you to bring the family in." I said, "Give me a week." I did not use that week to prepare a legal case. I used it to do the thing my profession had taught me was the only thing worth doing in a family dispute. I gathered the complete record and I let the record be the whole argument. I pulled every bank statement, every receipt, every signed instruction, every transfer log, 11 months of meticulous documentation, exactly the kind my job had trained me to keep without thinking about it. Then I called Adaeze, and I asked her to come, and I asked her to bring anyone in the family she wanted to have present, because I wanted as many people in the room as possible when the truth came out, so there would be no version of the day that could later be reframed. Adaeze arrived with 3 aunties and a cousin who had been particularly vocally sympathetic at the repast. She came in looking braced for a fight, and I gave her none, because I had learned from years of doing this work that a person who arrives for a fight and finds a conference table and a lawyer tends to deflate in ways that are more permanent than anything a fight could achieve. Mr. Asante played the recording without preamble. My mother's voice filled that room, and I watched my sister's face go through 4 things in approximately 30 seconds: recognition, confusion, understanding, and then something I had never seen on Adaeze's face before, which was a complete and total stillness. Not the stillness of composure. The stillness of a person whose entire framework has just collapsed and who doesn't yet know what's underneath. Mama talked for 45 minutes. She named every transaction. She explained every gift, the cousin who needed help, the church, the scholarship fund, the care costs, the amount and the date and the reason, all of it, in the voice of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing, who'd done the arithmetic in her head and on paper, who had been an accountant for 30 years and who was not going to leave her money story to anyone else's interpretation. And at the end, she said, and I will remember this sentence until I die, she said, I want to be clear that Zara did not take anything from me. She gave. For 4 years she gave up the life she was building and she came home and she took care of me, and everything she moved in my accounts she moved because I asked her to. If someone tells you different, they don't know what happened in this house. I know. This is my voice. This is what I know. The room was very quiet when the recording ended. And then Adaeze said, softly, not to me, almost to herself, she made that on purpose. And I said the sentence I'd say again exactly the same way. I said, she made it 3 months before she died. She sat in this office and she talked for 45 minutes so that when this day came, you wouldn't be able to say it was just my word. She knew you'd look at the accounts. She knew you'd assume. And she loved you too much to let you be wrong about me in public without a way back. The recording isn't for me, Adaeze. It's for you. She gave you a way back. My sister didn't say anything. The aunties were quiet. The cousin who had been sympathetic was looking at the table. And I did the thing I'd decided I would do if it got this far, the thing I'd thought about in Mama's house the night before. I closed the folder in front of me, and I left the complete documentation on the table for whoever wanted to look at it, and I said, I'll give you all some time, and I walked out of the room. Here is where the story becomes a choice, and it is not the choice my family expected, and it is probably not the one you'd expect either. Because I had everything. I had a recording, a documentation package, a lawyer, and a room full of relatives who had just watched my sister's accusation collapse in real time. Adaeze had stood up at a repast and called me a thief in front of 40 people. What I held, now, was the means to make sure those same 40 people knew, in the same public way, exactly what she had done and what the truth was. I thought about it. Walking back through that lobby, I thought about it seriously, because the humiliation of that repast, 40 faces turning, a room full of people who'd known me my whole life hearing my sister call me a thief, had left a mark that pure relief wasn't going to erase. I thought about calling the aunties, about making sure every person in that room got the full picture, about making Adaeze's professional and social standing feel the weight of what she'd done to mine. But I kept asking what I actually needed underneath the anger, and it was not Adaeze's destruction. It was my mother's truth, spoken, heard, and placed on the record where it belonged. I already had that. The recording existed. The documentation existed. The people in that room had heard Mama's voice. The truth was not just known, it was witnessed, in the most legally solid way possible, by the people who mattered most. Destroying Adaeze on top of that wouldn't give me anything the recording hadn't already given me. It would just make me the sister who finished someone who was already on the ground, and I did not want to be that person, and I am certain as I've ever been about anything, that it was not what Mama would have wanted either. I thought about her a lot in that lobby. What she would have done, in my position. Mama was not a soft woman, she was precise, and she had standards, and she did not let people off the hook for carelessness. But she also did not hold grudges past the point of usefulness. When a debt was paid, she moved on. And in that recording, she had given Adaeze the only thing that could really pay this debt, not an apology I'd forced out of her, not a humiliation I'd orchestrated, but the truth, clean and undeniable and delivered by Mama herself, with no cruelty attached to it. Mama had already decided what kind of justice this would be. I just had to be the kind of daughter who trusted her. So I did not call the 40 relatives. I did not post. I did not ask Mr. Asante to send the documentation to anyone who hadn't been in that room. What I did was let the people who had witnessed the repast and the recording talk to each other, which they did, because people always talk, and let the truth spread the way truth spreads when it doesn't need to be pushed, slowly, person by person, without my fingerprints on any of it. Adaeze called me 3 days later. And for the first time in my adult life, my sister's voice on the phone had nothing in it that I recognized. No authority, no competence, no warmth deployed as a weapon. She sounded like a person who had just understood something about herself that she couldn't put back. She said, "I didn't know about the recording." And I said, "I know." She said, "I thought, I looked at the accounts and I thought." And I said, "I know what you thought." Mama knew too. That's why she made it. There was a long silence, and then she said, "She was protecting you." And I said, "She was protecting both of us. She was giving you a way to be wrong without being unforgivable. She loved you, Adaeze. She just loved us both with her eyes open." My sister started to cry, and it was not the performing kind. I had seen her performing kind, and this wasn't it. She cried for a long time, and I let her, because some grief is just the weight of a story you've been carrying finally setting down. She said, I stood up at her repast. And I said, "I know." And she said, in front of everyone. And I said, "I know." And they also heard the recording. Those two things will live together in this family's memory, and you're going to have to be okay with that. She said, "I'm sorry." And it was a clean sentence, no instruction folded into it, nothing asking me to make it easier. The cleanest thing she'd ever said to me. The 18 months after that were not dramatic. That's the part these stories never show. Adaeze and I did not become what we'd never been. We were not suddenly the sisters who called each other every Sunday and knew each other's lives. But we became something realer than what we'd had before. She called, sometimes, not to report on her impressive life but to ask things, real questions, the kind you ask a person you've decided actually knows something. She asked me once how I'd managed the care for those 4 years without falling apart. I told her the truth, I hadn't always. She was quiet, and then she said, "I should have been there more." And I said, "Yes." And neither of us built anything on top of that, because some acknowledgments are complete in themselves. There was one moment, a few months later, that told me it had truly turned. Adaeze called me while I was at work, not in the evening, during the day, a Tuesday, as if she hadn't rehearsed it enough to pick a careful time, and she said, "I'm helping a friend settle her mother's estate. I don't know what I'm doing. Can I ask you something?" And she asked a real question, a good one, the kind you ask a person you've decided actually knows things. I answered her for 20 minutes. She listened to all of it. At the end she said, "You're good at this." 4 words. But they were the first 4 words my sister had ever said that put me in the category of good at something rather than merely present for something. I told her I'd learned from the best, and she knew I meant Mama, and she laughed, and it was a real laugh, and that was the beginning of something that might, eventually, become a friendship between 2 sisters who have only ever been strangers in the same family. The aunties sorted themselves out over time, the way family always does, some quickly, some slowly, some who've never quite said a direct word about the repast but whose behavior toward me shifted in the weeks after. One of them called me specifically, my mother's oldest friend, and she said, simply, "Your mama was a wise woman." I said I knew. She said, "She raised a wise daughter." I let that be enough. My mother's note, "You did everything right." I made sure they'll know. I keep it in a frame on my desk now. Not the recording, not the power of attorney, not the documentation I assembled. The note, 3 lines in her handwriting, because a legal document can be filed and forgotten, but a mother's handwriting in a bedside drawer is the thing that holds the shape of what was actually true. She knew who I was. She made sure the record knew it too. That was the whole gift, and it was enough. People ask me whether it was revenge. I didn't stand up at a repast and call anyone a thief. I didn't assemble a documentation package to destroy my sister. I assembled it because that's how my profession taught me to protect the truth, and the truth, as it happened, needed protecting. I didn't arrange for the recording to be played at the worst possible moment. Mama arranged for it, because she knew her daughters, and she loved us both enough to tell the truth before she couldn't. I didn't do a single one of the things that made the consequences arrive. Adaeze did the accusation, her own assumption did the damage, and our mother's recorded voice did what no argument of mine ever could have. All I did was document everything and sit still in a room and let the record speak. Here is what everybody lost. Adaeze lost the story, the one where she was the good daughter and I was the one who'd taken advantage. She lost it in a law office, to a recording made 3 months before Mama died, by the very mother she thought she'd been protecting. But she gained something too, a way back. Mama gave it to her on purpose, and she took it, and the taking of it was the most real thing my sister has ever done. The aunties lost the comfortable version of our family, the one where the daughter who'd left was noble and the daughter who'd stayed was suspect. They're still adjusting, most of them, in the quiet way people adjust when they realize they should have asked more questions before they turned their heads. And I lost something too, and it wasn't Adaeze. I lost the belief that the work I'd done, for years, the nights, the appointments, the love made unglamorous by constancy, would be enough, on its own, to protect me from doubt. It wasn't. Love is never enough. The document is what holds. I learned that from my job, and then I learned it again in the most personal way possible, and I am grateful, more grateful than I can easily say, that my mother understood it too, and loved me in the language I actually spoke. The language of preparation, of records kept, of truth placed somewhere safe before the moment it would be needed. I keep working in estates because I understand them differently now. Every family I help, every recording I arrange, every document I insist on filing when the client thinks it's unnecessary. I think of Mama sitting in Mr. Asante's office on a Tuesday afternoon, talking for 45 minutes into a recording device, making sure her daughter would not have to stand alone. That's what all of it is, in the end. It's love made into a document. It's care converted into something that holds after you're gone. It's the thing I do for strangers' families, now, because my own mother did it for me. They stood up at her repast and called me a thief in front of 40 people. It turned out our mother had already answered them, 3 months earlier, in her own voice, and had left it with the lawyer in case. So if there's someone in your life who's quietly doing the real work, the unglamorous work, the work nobody photographs, the work that looks like staying when everyone else left, and someone in a position to speak has decided that work is suspicious, is evidence of the wrong thing, is something to be scrutinized instead of honored, Ask yourself one thing tonight. Who actually knows what happened in that house? Who was there? And whose voice would you trust if it were recorded and played back in a room full of the people who'd already made up their minds? Thank you for staying with this story to the end. Every character and event in it is fictional, written for reflection and entertainment. But if any of it felt familiar, I hope it leaves you with this: document everything. Not because you expect to be accused, but because the truth, preserved carefully, is the most loving thing you can leave behind. The record doesn't argue, doesn't raise its voice, doesn't need you to defend it. It just speaks, in the voice of whoever cared enough to make it, long after the moment has passed. Keep the record. The record holds.